Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Geezer Bob's Book Club. My buddy Bob is here today to talk about a couple of books. The founder of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, John McEuen, has just released a book on August the 1st titled Will the Circle Be Unbroken? The Making of a Landmark Album 50th Anniversary. The title says it, Will the Circle Be Unbroken is an album that will have its 50th anniversary this coming November. But McEuen just released this book about this. But this follows a book that McEuen wrote and published a couple of 3 years ago that was more of an autobiography where he more talks about his life. But both these books, Bob says, they kind of work together. They're really two peas in a pod. So instead of just talking about one, Bob's here, he's read them both, and he's going to tell you about both of them. Take it away, Bobby.
All righty. Hey, thank you, Scotty. Yes. So, faithful viewers, today you get a special offer. You get 2 reviews for the price of 1. So we're going to talk about both books from John McEuen. The very first one we'll start off with is a book titled The Life I've Picked, which is his autobiography. Now, let me say up front, John McEuen is in the realm of acoustic music, bluegrass, and with the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, did a lot of country rock, pop music. So he's all over the place as far as genres. Now, you don't have to be a fan of his music to really enjoy this autobiography, because he's got some great stories in here about his life in music and the things that he's done and the people that he's encountered through that life. And he starts out, recounting his childhood in California, being high school friends with comedian and actor Steve Martin, how they worked together in the magic shop at Disneyland. They both picked up the banjo, learned to play banjo together. McEuen's older brother, Bill, was the manager of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band through 1981. He was also manager for Steve Martin. The older McEuen formed a film company called the Aspen Film Society, was executive producer of several of Steve Martin's movies, including The Jerk, executive producer of several other Hollywood movies, also a producer of Steve Martin's first 4 albums. So that's a nice little interesting connection they have there. McEuen was a founding member of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. He recounts the formation of the band, their early history, including a fascinating story about how in 1968, the band responded to an ad in the Daily Variety newspaper where they were looking for a band to portray an 1840s miners band for a movie called Paint Your Wagon, which was the movie adaptation of a Broadway musical. This movie wound up starring Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin, if you can imagine those two in a musical. So the band wound up spending 4 months out in the Oregon wilderness filming this movie. And they have a scene where they perform as a band, at this gold miners camp. And then they stayed on and served as extras throughout the movie. He recounts his infatuation with bluegrass music stemmed from seeing a performance of a group called the Dillards out in a club in California. And for those of us with Missouri roots, the Dillards, is a band from Salem, Missouri. The trivia part for them is they were the Darling family on the old Andy Griffith TV show. And anyway, McEuen recounts his life, the people that he's come into contact with. He has some great anecdotes from his life, and I want to share a couple of them with you. At one point, McEuen gets a phone call from a woman named Russie Allwine, and she proceeds to tell him that her husband, Wayne, has just passed away. And Wayne played banjo, guitar, piano, and other musical instruments, and was a big fan of McEuen's solo work. And she called because she said that Wayne's request was for McEuen to perform at his funeral. And so in the course of the conversation, McEuen finds out that Wayne and Russie Allwine were the voices for something like 35 years of Mickey and Minnie Mouse. So McEuen winds up performing at the graveside services for Wayne Allwine at Forest Hill Cemetery in California in the shadow of Walt Disney's crypt. And at one point, Russie Allwine hands McEuen her late husband's banjo and asks him to lead the assembled mourners in a rendition of the Mickey Mouse song, which he does. He also recounts a story that kind of relates to me of the band performing at a place called Tola's Deli outside Miller, Missouri. And this is an outdoor amphitheater and deli restaurant. And I attended concerts there when I was in college in Springfield. So he recounts it's a hot summer. They go there to perform. And when they go to collect their gate receipts, the owner and promoter is trying to stiff them the money that they're owed. And he's coming against like, well, we didn't sell enough, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in the course of negotiating with the owner, he winds up offering this young girl who appears to be about 13 that he claims his daughter, and offers her up to the band in lieu of being paid in money. And so one of the managers for the band, who was about 6'4", McEuen recounts in his book, Lance did not appreciate this offer to participate in the trade with the guy's daughter. Doing a slow burn, he stood up to his full 6'4" height with a few extra inches from her boot heels. He picked up the shorter Detola, the owner of the deli, by his shirt collar, lifted him above his own bulging eye level as Detola's feet dangled. Lance calmly screamed through thin lips into the promoter's face, "Give me my band's effing money, you bastard, or I'll kill you right here." They got the money. He recounts getting a phone call from Tommy Lee Jones and winding up doing the film score for Jones's movie, The Good Old Boys. And anyway, it's a fascinating look into McEwen's life, what it was like to be a traveling musician, all of the different people that he's come into contact with, including performing with Andy Williams, in a Las Vegas set. He recounts, and this is where the book The Life I Picked and McEwen's new book dovetail, because in both books he recounts forming a friendship with Earl Scruggs, who was the half of the famous bluegrass duo Flatt and Scruggs, and how that friendship with Earl Scruggs led to the landmark recording of the Will the Circle Be Unbroken album. So he covers some dual territory, in both books. So they make good companion pieces. Now, the newest book, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, is a 50th anniversary tribute to the release of that album. And it was released 50 years ago in November of 1972. And like I said, the formation of this album really started with the friendship that they developed with Earl Scruggs. And in 1969, the Dirt Band recorded an album called Uncle Charlie and His Dog Teddy. That was their big breakthrough album. It had 3 hit singles coming off of that album, including their cover of Jerry Jeff Walker's Mr. Bojangles. That finally gave the band some national exposure. And on the album, they had McEuen had done his cover version of an Earl Scruggs tune called Randy Lynn Rag. Well, Gary Scruggs, who was the son of Earl Scruggs, heard the album, really liked it, took it home to his parents and had them listen to it. Well, the Dirt Band was getting ready to do a show at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, not far from where the Scruggs family lived. So they went to see the show, got a chance to go meet the Dirt Band backstage, and this friendship sprang up. And when they were getting ready to leave, Earl Scruggs make a comment of, "Hey, I'd like to record with you guys someday." Well, fast forward a few months, the Earl Scruggs Review, which is the band that Earl Scruggs put together after breaking up with his longtime partner, Lester Flatt, is playing at a club in Colorado where the Dirt Band lives. They go to see the show. Jeff Hanna, one of the members of the band, and McEuen are heading back to Scruggs' hotel with him. And so McEuen says, hey, were you serious about wanting to record with us? Yeah. He said, so we have this idea, and he pitches the idea of doing the Will the Circle Be Unbroken album. And Scruggs says, I'm in. And they used Earl Scruggs as a way to connect with the classic country and folk artists that wound up recording on the Will the Circle Be Unbroken album. And that was the genesis of how this landmark recording got started. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with this album, like I said, it was released in November 1972. And in 1971, John McEuen and his brother Bill McEuen, who at the time was the manager of the Dirt Band, got this idea that they wanted to go to Nashville and record with the veterans of country, bluegrass, and folk music. And they wanted to do this as a tribute to the type of music that they grew up loving as young kids out in California. And so this was the idea that was pitched to Earl Scruggs. They ultimately wound up in Nashville recording an album with these country music stars like Maybelle Carter, Earl Scruggs, Doc Watson, Roy Acuff, Merle Travis, Jimmy Martin, and then some really outstanding Nashville session musicians like Vassar Clements, Junior Husky, Norman Blake, and Pete Oswald Kirby. And they and the Dirt Band wound up not being the stars of this album. It wasn't a thing of where, hey, we want you old guys to come and back us up. We're here to back you up and to make you the stars of this album. And if you look at the cover of the album, on the left side of it, it lists all of these veteran country performers. And then on the right side of the album, and it says, and the Dirt Band. So the Dirt Band checked their egos at the door and let these veteran performers take the spotlight. Now, these were veteran performers that really weren't part of the country music scene in 1971. You know, they were from a preceding era, but this was the era that the Dirt Band members, you know, loved so much. And so anyway, they spent a week in the studio in Nashville and recorded nearly 40 songs, you know, with these veteran performers. It became a landmark album, a huge selling album. It revitalized the careers of these veteran performers and found a new audience for them, particularly on college campuses all across the country. And in fact, I saw the Earl Scruggs Review and the Dirt Band perform in 1975 at the University of Missouri at Columbia. And interestingly, this album sold better with young people than it did with the country music world. So anyway, it is a landmark album. It was a great crossover thing, and it bridged a generation. And I remember my dad was 41 years old when I was born. I was 17 when the Will the Circle Be Unbroken album came out. My dad was, I think, 58 at the time. So there was a huge generation gap with us. But this was the music of his youth, and it had people from my generation performing on it. And it was something I could go to my dad and say, hey, Dad, you got to listen to this album I just bought. So he and I found a bridge through this music. Anyway, McEuen goes into detail about how this album came about, the recording sessions. It features a ton of photographs that were taken during the recording session by his brother, Mill McEuen. And these photos are interspersed all through the book. McEuen writes about, you know, what's going on when these photos were taken. He recounts some of the history, you know, the brief biographies of the different performers. It's a fascinating look into how this album was put together. If I have a complaint about the book, is I think it bogs down a little bit because he maybe gets into just a little bit too much detail. For example, Vassar Clements, the fiddle player on this album, McEuen tells us about at least 3 different times how Clements would never look at his instrument while he was playing. Yeah, he would just be looking out all over the place and just letting the music happen. And he does that a lot. He repeats a lot of stuff in here about, well, this is how Jimmy Martin made this chord. This is how Earl Scruggs picked the banjo and stuff. And I guess if you're a musician, that kind of detail may infatuate you. To me, it got a little old. And it's like, okay, John, you already told me about how Vassar Clements plays the fiddle. I don't need to hear it 3 times. So that's my negative about the book. But he has a lot of other people who help him out with this book. There's a foreword written by Ken Burns, the famous documentarian for PBS. And in 2019, Ken Burns did an 8-part series on country music for PBS. One of the episodes was called Will the Circle Be Unbroken? And he devoted about 20 minutes to this album and the impact and how important it was. So Ken Burns writes a foreword. A lot of people who participated in this also share their remembrances of it, including Steve Martin. And one of the things I learned was that Steve Martin was in Nashville in August of '71 while this album was being recorded. And Bill McEuen was also recording Steve Martin playing banjo in some separate sessions using some of the same players as on the Circle session. And Steve Martin got to meet Earl Scruggs. And there's a photo in the book of Scruggs and Martin jamming together in a motel room. And the sessions that were recorded with Steve Martin wound up on Martin's 1981 album called the Steve Martin Brothers. So I didn't know that there was a Steve Martin connection, to this recording. And I learned some interesting things about the making of this album. It wound up being a 3-album set, which was kind of unusual for the time. And the cover and the whole packaging of the album was very intricate. And on the cover of the album, there is handwritten calligraphy done by Bill McEwen's wife. And it took her about 2 days to do the calligraphy. And she did it on parchment paper. Well, Bill McEuen wanted the parchment to look aged. So he took the finished product, put it in an oven to age it, left it in a little too long, and it caught fire. So his wife had to redo her 2 days of calligraphy work. And the second time around, he lowered the temperature in the oven, and goes into the whole detail about how they made the album cover with the assistance of Dean Torrance, who had a graphic design company. And Dean Torrance was half of the old surf group called Jan and Dean. And he became a graphic artist after Jan Barry, his partner, got into a severe car wreck and could no longer perform. And the book treats with reverence, these veteran country performers. And there's one part where Mother Maybelle Carter, who was a member of the famous Carter family, who did their first recording sessions in 1927, is in the studio. And Jeff Hanna, one of the vocalists from the Dirt Band, there's a picture of him. He's sitting at Maybelle Carter's feet, staring up at her reverently while she's singing. And Hannah is going to lend backing vocals to it. And you could just see him sitting there at her feet, looking up at her, in reverence that he's singing with, someone of this stature. And, McEuen writes about that, how these young, long-haired, musicians are recording with these veterans of another generation. And the photos paint a really interesting juxtaposition, because here you've got the long hair and the beards and mustaches from the Dirt Band along these, well-groomed, short-haired, clean-cut veterans. And Roy Acuff, who was one of the premier country stars that they wanted, he's in the recording sessions, wearing a suit and tie. And it took about a week for them to finally get Roy Acuff to agree. And he was very reluctant, initially to do it, because he was kind of uncertain about these hippies and stuff. And finally, Roy Acuff shows up and says, okay, let me hear what you've done so far. So they play the stuff that they've recorded for him so far. And Acuff, as the story goes, is like, heck, that's just country music. I'll be here tomorrow morning, boys. And so Acuff shows up. They wanted Bill Monroe, who is known as the father of bluegrass music. Monroe wanted nothing to do with this. He figured that his audience would turn on him for recording with these hippies. And McEuen recounts how several years later, after the success of this album, he encounters Monroe. And Monroe said, hey, if y'all ever do another one of those circle albums, let me know. And so instead, they got Jimmy Martin, who became known as the king of bluegrass music, instead of Bill Monroe. I grew up with an appreciation for good, solid country music. So this was an album that I bought when it came out 50 years ago. I still have the album. I also have it on CD. So it's something that I really appreciate. And I think you might find the book interesting if you're really into wanting to know how this album came about, what went in making it happen, and all of that. So 2 books that I would recommend, both by John McEuen. His autobiography is a fascinating story about his life. And then the 50th anniversary book on Will the Circle Be Unbroken gives you a lot of detail about how this album came to be. So I recommend both of them, but I do give you the caveat that the second book, it is a little bit of a slog in places, but still pretty fascinating. So that's my take, Scotty.
Well, there you have it, everybody. If you're fans of the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, or just generally fans of country music, especially traditional country music, this might be right up your alley. Check it out. Yeah, thanks for checking in with us. Hit that subscribe button and stick with us for a couple of weeks. We'll have some more stuff coming up. Bob will have another book review for you next week about Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan, a book about those 2 guys. It was pretty interesting. So, yep, hit that subscribe button, keep up with what we're doing, and we will talk to you soon. So long.